Welcome everyone to the second day of the Radical Solidarity Summit. Today's theme is text, language, and the transmission of knowledge. We'll have a program of 2 panel discussions and possibly a film screening in between. Our first panel discussion is titled Over the Seas and Into the Web, Critical Voices and Literary Resistance from the Online Public Sphere, moderated by myself, Sakhisizwe Gcina. I'm a part of the curatorial team at Zeitz MOCAA, and I will be joined with panelists Nontsikelelo Mutiti, Bukola Oyebode, Awa Konaté, and Rémy Ngamije. Thereafter, there might be a film screening of Zaheer's Rahmani's film titled Seismography of Struggle Towards a Global History of Critical and Cultural Journals at 5:30 p.m. South African Standard Time. We'll confirm that at 4:30, and after our first panel discussion, you'd have to watch that film on our YouTube live page, and you'll find the link in our chat feature. Thereafter, we'll have another panel discussion titled Decolonizing Text, Future Possibilities, moderated by our assistant curator, Thandazani Tlakama, along with the panelists, Frida Ikoto, Nadia Davids, and Francois Verger, beginning at 6:30 p.m. South African Standard Time, and will be on this Zoom platform. So after the film screening on the YouTube Live, please return to Zoom using the same link. And then the last event for the day is a reading, also by Thandazani Tlakama, who will read texts by Kenyan author Binyavanga Wainaina titled Who Invented Truth? And another text, How to Be an African. So I also want to go through a few house rules. We request that everyone please remain respectful and open-minded throughout the conversation. We advise our attendees that everyone has been automatically muted and that you can write and send your questions to the panelists through the Q&A feature, and we'll answer your questions later in the discussion. And then you're also welcome to leave your comments and thoughts using the chat feature. Please also engage with us on social media, and our social media platforms on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter with the hashtag Radical Solidarity. And please don't forget to mention and tag us at Zeitz MOCAA. Okay, so I'll begin the panel Over the Seas and Into the Web by making an introduction to our panelists. It's our pleasure to host them. I'm very excited towards our conversation. I think it will be rich, engaging, and thought-provoking, and highly relevant to the global moment of today. The first panelist I'd like to introduce is Bukola Oyebode. She's an art writer, editor, and publisher. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of the art magazine, The Soul Adventurer. She has worked in the media, particularly broadcasting, since 2011 in different positions. As a writer, she has made contributions to online and print magazines and exhibition publications. She has covered the major biennales, including Duck Art from Senegal, Venice Biennale in Italy, and Georgia Biennale in Indonesia. She regularly speaks about digital publishing and the position of women in the arts. Next, we have Nontsikelelo Mutiti. She's a Zimbabwean born. Oh, Bukola is joining us from Amsterdam currently. So you'll find our panelists come from different parts of the world, which I find will make our conversation more interesting. Nontsikelelo Mutiti is a Zimbabwean-born visual artist and educator. She is invested in elevating the work and practices of Black people, past, present, and future, through a conceptual approach to design, experimental publishing, and archiving practices and peer-to-peer collaborations. She holds a diploma in multimedia art from the Zimbabwe Institute of Digital Arts and an MFA from Yale School of Art with a specialization in graphic design. She's also currently assistant professor in graphic design at Virginia Commonwealth University. That's where she is currently joining us from, Virginia in the United States of America. Next, we have Rémy Ngamije. He is a Rwandan-born and Namibian-based writer and photographer. He published a debut novel, The Eternal Audience of One, and he is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Duk, which is Namibia's first literary magazine. And his work has appeared in numerous publications, and most importantly, he has recently been shortlisted for the AKO Kane Prize for African Writing this year. And then last but certainly not least, we have Awa Konaté. She is currently joining, Rémy is currently joining us from Windhoek in Namibia. Awa Konaté is currently joining us from London in the UK. She is a London and Copenhagen-based Danish Ivorian writer, researcher, and curator. She's the founder of the interdisciplinary research platform, Culture Art Society, that intersects critical studies and art theory to research the cultural economy of African archives and advocates for African cultural activism as well as arts education. Her research is committed to a philosophy of accessibility that circumvents hierarchies of cultural canons and their distribution, drawing on a critical practice, curatorial practice called memory work, which pursues the ways in which the archive affects and reaffirms liberatory practices. Welcome to you all. It's a pleasure for me to host you for this panel, and I appreciate that you agreed to participate. So I wanted to start our conversation by unpacking the title of the panel, which is Over the Seas and Into the Web. And this title is actually inspired by Tabitha Reiser, an artist who ran a project called Exotic Trade and Afro-Cyber Resistance. She describes herself as Franco-Guyano-Danish and health tech political therapist, chemetic, and Kundalini yoga teacher. So she looks at the way ocean, seas, and the histories of migration that are informed by the ocean connect to the development of information and communication technologies, specifically looking at how, for example, optic cables under the seabed also follow colonial shipping trade routes, and the architecture of the internet, both in its physicality and tangible sense, but also in its figurative sense, has the ability to replicate structures of colonial violence, but also spaces of resistance and healing within that structure. And I think it's interesting to also think about the idea of a web, not only as an online digital space, but also as a space of interconnectivity, and how the colonial histories have created entanglements and cross-cultural connections, and similar to yesterday's conversation, the idea of a transnational solidarity during liberation movements. And this certainly speaks to the moment we experience globally today with the Black Lives Matter movement, and how we, in this period of hashtag activism, and that has its own history related to, for example, locally, the Arab Spring, which yesterday Koyo renamed the African Spring movement, that started as early as 2011. And this hashtag activism has come to define our generation, as a way to coordinate, organize, and mobilize people for a cause. And so I find this synthesis between the ocean as a spiritual vessel and a historical archive, and a space of memory, find its connection with ideas around technological advancement, communication, digital and information, securitization, the monetization of access to knowledge online, and data sharing. So with that being said, I'd like to pose a question to our panelists, and I'd like Bukola to please answer first. And the question is, what or how has the experience of hashtag activism, specifically like the hashtag Black Lives Matter, or even to go further, in your case, TSA has used the hashtag resistance and revolution within your specific geopolitical context and online platform?
Okay, thank you, Saki. I would start by saying that I was up until recently not a believer. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I was up until now not a believer of hashtag activism, because I have always believed that to make things happen, to make things work, you need to be physically present, you need to be on ground, you need to take the action to the people who are making decisions. And for the longest time, the people who are making decisions were not paying attention online, So for me, hashtag activism has always been, okay, we are talking amongst ourselves, but the people who are going to change, who are going to make changes are somewhere in their offices, in their big mansions, in the government, and they are only hearing what you are saying through their advisors or people who are managing their platforms. But then things started to shift. And it became obvious that activism online can actually bring changes in reality. And so when the pandemic started, for instance, and social distancing became the big phrase of how to deal with the pandemic, with the coronavirus, of the safety phrase for the pandemic, I thought, well, maybe it's the time that I join, or TSA as a platform, join the group who are asking for social solidarity instead of social distancing. And from social solidarity, we started to create a sort of connection with other people in the world. And then from the pandemic, the crisis in the United States started. The inequalities of now started to come to fore because, well, there's the police brutality, there's the gender discrimination, there's the injustice against people of a lower class, there's no health care for everyone, people are suffering, they don't have access to a lot of things. And because we're all in a lockdown, all of this started to come out, like in discussions online. And when we got to a point, we thought, okay, this is no longer about solidarity. It's about resisting all that is happening in the world now. It's about how are we going to survive now? And then resistance and revolution hashtag started. And for the resistance and revolution is about asking the questions, how are we navigating now? How can we de-automate, or how are we de-automating? How is the internet creating a space of connection for us? We can see that the internet has been a tool for connection, a powerful tool actually, because when the lockdown started, all activities or almost all activities in the world moved online. And so a number of voices that were hitherto silenced or unheard became prominent or became visible. And it's a number of things. Can you, particularly the solidarity, the social solidarity, the resistance and revolution has been about coming together, and this and about enabling or putting out the voices of artists, of different contributors at the core of the art world. And this has been how we have forged our work at TSA in the last months. And this has been our own activism in a way.
Thank you, Bukola. I find what's interesting is this idea of in a space of the real world where there's restriction on mobility and also social distancing, as you mentioned. On the online world, you can find a space of social solidarity. And yesterday we're speaking around the idea of de-borderization. The online space is always perceived as being open and democratic, or a space that tries to democratize access to information. But quite often, like you mentioned, your critique of hashtag activism, it's also perceived as a space where there's a lot of so-called couch intellectualism, where people feel they've done enough to only post and share on their social media, but don't actually translate to real world effects. And I think also, just to add more onto what you were saying about TSA, is there's an idea of isolation that occurs when you're living under lockdown, and how you find what you were artists on your platform were sharing were also a playlist, music playlists, for example. And so there's still that element of music that is often quite part of gatherings, even when it's not being heard live and you're dancing together. So I wonder, in this context of de-borderization, how is it then there are still parameters that prevent certain forms of engagement and solidarity that exist in the online space. But I wanted to ask Nonsi this question around the relationship between the online space and the physical space, because you've been part of Black Lives Matter projects for many years, since as early as 2014 or 15. And I believe the initial engagement was actually an occupation of physical space. Can you please speak more about that?
Well, I think that's an interesting way to put it, and is kind of telling, because when you think about the Black Women Artists for Black Lives Matter intervention, what you see from Cape Town is the outward expression, something that took up space at the New Museum in New York, but that was actually, months, about 2 or 3 months of meeting outside of the museum hours, trying to find space for ourselves in the cut, almost like how people would try to find space for themselves online, on Twitter, other spaces, like Bukola saying, a space to be together, a space to kind of congregate, have shared values, hold each other, make space for each other, advocate for each other. So it's not so much about the outward expression, the actual work was really making space and taking care, and we really set out to do that. It was a devastating moment, so many images coming to us over and over again, all this police brutality, and there were two murders that happened in succession in the space of a week, which were really, a huge knock. I still remember being at an art opening with colleagues, and we were kind of all there to support a colleague, but just the conversation was about we need each other, we need to recover, we need to kind of bolster, and this is where that came out of, also thinking about access, what access do we have and how do we leverage that for the community. So Simone Lee at the time had the waiting room project, which was about healing at the New Museum, and then advocated for the rest of the community to be able to have access to the space to come together, to have these conversations and just really be. I wanted to pick up on some of the things you mentioned in the beginning, because I think that's important. This idea of water, the ocean is a body of substance that moves, that travels, that touches many edges. And this idea of the hashtag, for me, is a way of indexing, is a way of aggregating, trying to, I think about it more in kind of after the fact and not necessarily in real time. I go to look for conversations sort of when they're midway or after they've been happening, and I have a space to find them, what's been going on. It allows me to see into spaces that don't have access to. So in a way, for me, I acknowledge the borders. I acknowledge that things are happening in real time, and I'm outside of that time often. I acknowledge that something's happening on the ground, like in Richmond, Virginia. We have the longest running protests since the uprising started this summer in America. And, I can't go down to the circle, which has been renamed, reclaimed by the community, mostly young people like my students. But I follow the hashtags, I follow what they're posting. I want to see what has happened. And my front line is different to their front line. So I always want to also acknowledge that even though we think about this idea of the borderless, those borders still exist, but we have little windows, little apertures to see in and to access and to feel like we're touching, which is important. And then, this idea of the crisis now, I feel a lot has been coming to me in many conversations, but we have to acknowledge that this crisis has been, and this is just another eruption. It's no different from maybe early slave revolt or the civil rights movement. This has been an ongoing moment, and there's little eruptions when people have gotten to fever pitch, like we've had enough, like this is now too much, but it's been too much. And I want to acknowledge that the work was my work in terms of solidarity did not start when I came to the US. This is work from Zimbabwe. This is work from working with Magamba Culture Activist Network, which is mainly musicians and poets doing work, writing about, the hope that we have as young people for our country, the way we've dealt with oppression, and and poverty and all kinds of crises in Zimbabwe. And this is pre coming to the US, so pre-2009, really being involved, producing posters, producing merchandise, participating in performances every single Saturday at the Manenberg, at the Book Cafe. And so this is movement work, movement building, but also kind of in a supporting role as an artist and designer to kind of help frame a voice, to help create a marker that people can recognize and point to, like the graphics for Black women artists or Black Lives Matter, to also add a skill to help people articulate what they want to say, statement making, and allowing there to be vehicles to push that language out, to make it very visible and dynamic, and to create vehicles for broadcast. So that's how I see my work. And all those things can happen in real life, online, in so many different ways. And in Zimbabwe, I think maybe the difference, the shift between being in the US and being back home, so many of those things happened, but you couldn't necessarily take it out onto the street. You couldn't really occupy like a really exposed, prominent cultural institution. Everything felt very underground, whereas in the US, even as much as the police are really clamping down, it's almost like riot police kind of style that I've experienced back home. There is still a sense that you can go onto the street. I've marched in Times Square, which was the first for me. Well, after the George Zimmerman non-indictment, this is even pre the Black Women Artists for Black Lives Matter intervention at the New Museum. So these are things that we continue to do. We'll keep doing them after this, because this moment continues. There's still a lot of things to work on, and I think there's for all this, for the moment of whispering, for the moment of tweeting, for the moment of producing the banner, producing the T-shirt, advocating for people to have space to organize. I think there's going to be, we have to sustain this kind of work.
I like how both Bukola and Notsi have mentioned that the issues, the social political issues that have been exposed and heightened are not new, and that they've been ongoing for a while. And I find that there's an interesting relationship between the video material that was used to push the Black Lives Matter movement, how all of a sudden to have footage released suddenly made it very real for maybe white people who couldn't really experience it in their everyday lived experience, or also the idea of how a lot of times in the recent posts, there's been a call that when you use that hashtag, that it should also come with access to information about centers where people can go for assistance, or Black-owned businesses. And there's also tied to petitions to defund the police, for example, in other situations. But once again, I think it speaks to how, as much as there's a lot happening online, it cannot exist without some form of support and action in the real world. And quite often they might even reflect each other's power dynamics and relations. And I also wanted to mention that it's interesting how the Black Lives Matter hashtag within the context of Zimbabwe has actually evolved to Zimbabwean Lives Matter. And that's a sense of specificity that we also have to acknowledge, that as much as there are shared experiences of oppression, and anti-Black racism across the globe, it also carries its own nuances within specific contexts, like you mentioned about Zimbabwe. And so perhaps what does the liberatory nature of the online space mean within the context when you live under an authoritative regime? So I also want to ask Awa about this, because I feel there's a lot about your context, which is the Nordic countries, that quite often is underrepresented within this conversation, and even beginning with its own colonial history that is quite often invisible, and the idea of Nordic exceptionalism in the conversations about race and resistance.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. So to begin with your question, personally, in my opinion, I would say that hashtags have been incredibly significant to organization in terms of the activist field. I mean, in the beginning of the pandemic, and when we saw, the movement really erupting from Minneapolis in the US, we knew for a fact that a lot of activists were quite dependent on using the online space and using hashtags as a way of organizing to not have their organization intercepted by police forces and other form of like militarized forms. Now, problem with hashtag is also that they are very, very porous in their use, right? You can use them to organize and try to increase your presence and the changes that you're demanding, but they can also very much be used to maintain a state quo in some sense. And this is what I think it goes back to when you were talking about like couch intellectualism or couch activism. Some people put a hashtag and then they feel like they can relax and then they've done enough. But going back to the case of the Nordic region, in terms of hashtags and the online space, I would say that the movement that we've seen erupt on the scale that it has across Norway, across Sweden, across Denmark and Finland is in some way also very much not dependent, but it's in some way very much in conversation with what's happening in the US. But this is the first time within the Nordic context that we've seen such large scale movements of people in some way, not bringing attention, but in some way visibilizing on a larger scale what is really happening and what the state of anti-Black racism really is for Black people. And now the online space has been incredibly integral to that because, being a Black people across the Nordic region or people of African descent across the Nordic region are within the diaspora a very, very small minority. We don't have the same cultural presence and we don't have the same visible presence as people in the UK or people in the France or in Italy or in Spain. And our organization has very much also been dependent on us trying to align ourselves with other people within the diaspora as a way of drawing our attention to a historical continuum that is, anti-Blackness that has no form of global barriers really or any global borders because it's present everywhere. And the online space has been crucial for us. We're seeing pages erupt on a large scale with people talking about the everyday racism that they encounter amongst their fellow citizens, or even the everyday racism that they encounter within institutional and structural spaces. And what that's also really doing is that we are becoming far more organized across the groups that we have dispersed as within our communities and trying to actually get together and finding ways to I try to, when I talk about what's going on in the Nordic region, I try very much to move away from this idea that we're merely just trying to subvert things. Because I think like a lot of our language around activism, even in the online space, but especially in the online space, is that we're constantly fixated and thinking about how to undo things, how to dismantle things. And we don't really have a form of language alternative to how we are able to have a practice of care in our resistance, to have a practice of joy in our resistance. And I feel that the online space is allowing for us to do that even more than we had before.
And I want to mention here a little bit more information about the context of Denmark specifically, and the fact it has some of the most aggressive and restrictive anti-immigration policies enforced, and this idea of how constitutional efforts and legislative measures are being used to police and punish Black lives, and how the way it's framed within the media is quite often about the threat of integration, the labor security, for example. I mean, it goes to such an extent speaking about a pandemic, which I think we can speak about it with within a context of the pandemic of socioeconomic inequality and global capitalism. There was a policy from the Prime Minister of Denmark to actually isolate immigrants on an island called Lordham Island, and the ferry that takes them to this island is named Virus, and that island was actually formerly a veterinary laboratory, and it requires to be detoxified.
And it should, sorry,
that,
yeah. So I was going to say,
yes.
Just to build on what you're saying, and here again, where I think language really comes into the matter, it should be specified that it was not just migrants or immigrant communities, it was Black migrant communities that were being urged. So, you know, across the UK and across the US, we've seen that Black people are dying at much higher rates of COVID-19. And that's of course because that Black people are much more vulnerable to some of the structural inequalities that exist within their societies. And that's also been the case in Denmark. You know, across Denmark, Black people, the unemployment rates are higher for Black migrant communities or even Black communities, and the earning wages are also much lower by percentage. And what that's done is that in context or in situations of global pandemics where both economies and communities are particularly vulnerable, Black people have been extra vulnerable. And with that, there have been increased rates of COVID-19 among Somali communities. And the encouragement from our politicians follows a particularly violent and very racist rhetoric, which has been to suggest that there should be implemented laws that force Black people to wear masks, that force Black people to have to isolate or sort of be separated from wider society. And the thing with the Nordic region is, and which is why I think this year has been so significant to how we're even having conversations about anti-Black racism across the Nordic. This is the first time that we're having a question, or the idea of the Nordic exceptionalism, as you're saying, is put under a microscope and interrogated. And we're asking, is it really feasible? Is it really viable? And if it is, what are the particularities and the conditions that make this exceptionalism as has been standing for many years? You know, for us, and this is very frustrating for me as a person of, you know, a Nordic and a Scandinavian African descent, to be in the inside within the Nordic context, and then also to be outside and hear how often the idea of Nordic societies and the idea of Nordic welfare states are employed by, you know, activists and political rhetorics, especially in the US, where they're like, oh, we should be looking to the Nordic countries. They've been doing so well. And amidst that discussion and that dialogue is a complete erasure of the fact that, you know, the Nordic regions are not exempt from a very deep and violent history of anti-Blackness. They're not exempt from a history of colonialism, sorry. And as you're saying, they are also not exempt from a history of which the sea is located as their both capital and merchants and the welfare state and everything else in between, and continues to be today. So yeah.
Yes, and before I move on to Rémy, I just wanted to also add that the work on your platform, CAS, which is on Instagram, is looking at this idea of joy and a celebration of Black culture in ways that I find interesting. For example, finding out about Black jazz musicians or Afro-Danish jazz musicians and poets and authors and even photographers who documented the Black Power movement of the 70s in the USA. It is actually a relationship of artists who are Afro-Danish that have documented a lot of Black liberation movements from around the world. And I want to ask Rémy about when you, Awa, you spoke about historical erasure. I think within the context of Namibia and its own German colonial history and genocide against Nama and Herero people, and thereafter having to face the South African apartheid regime, and only until I think independence was in 1990 from South Africa. Until this day, South Africa still rules over Walvis Bay and Penguin Island off the coast of Namibia. And I wanted to ask Rémy about, he's spoken about a small space, and in his most recent editorial, he spoke about the idea of being part of a small space, and also the idea of yes. Sorry, Rémy, you wanted to say something? Okay, and also the idea of the desert landscape, both physically and figuratively, that makes up so much of in Namibia, and the literary and publishing canon and landscape of Namibia, reflecting this idea of a desertification and being a small space. Can you please speak more about that, Rémy?
Thanks so much for including me, Saki. I really appreciate it. And I'm really glad that I get to go last after all of these smart women, because then I get to say I agree with everything that they said and not have to say anything dumb on my part. So yeah. No, I'm joking. First of all, I think I'll try and tie everything up together. The idea of a small space, whatever it is that you conceive that, I think currently right now, this lockdown that we have going on worldwide, with nobody traveling, with restricted movement, and everyone, you know, having to come to grips with their everyday situation, is the best example of a small space. And I'll use a personal example. So before I became a published writer, I thought to be a writer, I would have to move to New York, find some, I don't know, brick brownstone or something, and then, you know, carry my little leather brown satchel, vote Democrat, and, you know, take part in like activists and stuff like that. And I thought that was what being a writer was, that to be a writer, you had to leave your current place and go somewhere else. And that was my idea of like what a big part of the world was, New York or London or Berlin or any of these other places. But now that we're all in lockdown, wherever you are, regardless of whether you're in Windhoek, New York, London, Rio, whatever, and you can't go anywhere. And in some instances, you can't go outside your house or outside your neighborhood or outside your street. It really doesn't matter where you are, because everywhere you are, regardless of its demographics or its privilege, becomes a small space. And I was interested in discovering what that meant to people in this current place, in this current time, when we can't enjoy the things that make our own geographic spaces. And you know, you are correct that most of Namibia is a desert. It is a desert and semi-arid, doesn't rain a lot of the time, and that makes the spaces in which we can live that are habitable even smaller. And so we are more crowded together. And so this period of lockdown has brought us into a lot of conflict with each other, because we've never had to be with each other for this extended period of time before. And that's brought a lot of conflicts to the fore, it's brought a lot of debates, and it's also brought a lot of a lot of examples of privilege to the forefront, like hashtag activism. We've never had to confront hashtag activism because for us, internet is a luxury. And so things that happen on the internet, hashtags, trending topics, whatever, don't often filter down to society, ordinary Namibian society, because ordinary Namibian society doesn't have access to internet. So when you're talking about hashtag activism, you're literally talking about all the private school kids like me who can afford it. You're not talking about the average Namibian. And so for me, my resistance to hashtag activism is, again, it's not that it is not inactive. It is that it is very effective when you're dealing with a particular demographic or society, i.e. people like me. You can start a hashtag and say, we are boycotting orange cups. And because I have internet access, I can see, I don't agree with this orange cup, so we're not putting money towards orange cups. But if you're in the township and you have no cell phone, no laptop, no internet access, that hashtag means nothing to you. You're still working on a bread and butter society where you need feet in the streets, you need flyers or whatever. And even that in itself also raises other questions of privilege. Like back in the day when the socialists and the communists were printing pamphlets and dropping them all over Moscow or whatever. You needed those, in order for those pamphlets to be effective, you needed to be assured that your people could read. So for me, the modes of activism are pretty pointless if the people that they're trying to reach are not able to participate in, say, activism. If you say boycott Woolies, who's going to boycott Woolies in Namibia? First of all, none of us shop at Woolies because we can't afford it. Secondly, we don't even have internet access to know that we are boycotting Woolies now. So that activism is definitely not for us. With the Black Lives Matter movement, is that for us? Yes. Does it affect us? Yes. Is it reaching us in the way that it needs to be reaching us? Not necessarily. And that's because we're alienated from the privileged structures that allow us to also have a voice in this conversation. And that, for example, allows us as Namibians to sometimes feel this sense of alienation, that the world happens somewhere else, that these conversations take part in Cape Town, in San Francisco, in Lisbon, but not over here. But the fact of the matter is that the whole world is a small space, and that what Nontsikelelo is going through and that you're going through, I'm going through here in Windhoek as well. The goal of these hashtags for me is that it makes me feel less lonely, makes me feel less isolated, and that I know that solidarity has no borders, that if Awa is going through a problem in Scandinavia, I as a Namibian in Southern Africa can relate to her, and that I can somehow tell her, yo, you are not alone in this. And even though I can't provide any material support in the way of changing the social structures that affect her specifically, at least she's got this consciousness that I am not alone in this struggle. And I think for me, that is the great goal of this hashtag activism. It's actively fighting against the sense of loneliness that, for example, I might feel here. Right now, I'm able to connect with you. I'm able to connect with Bukola. Where would we be if this space wasn't created, if this platform wasn't working? So for me, those hashtag things are effective in particular geographies and territories with particular classes of people, but not, for example, universal. And so I'm always careful to couch my understanding with at least with some contextual examples. And I can tell you from me here in Namibia, in a desert, with the economic system that we have, with our levels of privilege and access and whatnot, often stacked against the ordinary and average Namibian, I'm not sure whether hashtag activism is the best way. And I'm not even sure whether the printed material is the best way, because we also still struggle with literacy and with access to literacy within our own border, So it is ironic in some way, in a cruel sense of irony. You introduced me as the editor-in-chief of Namibia's first literary and online magazine. And the question I ask myself every day is, I'm online, but I'm also in a weird way in the back of my head aware that that's not where most Namibians are. And so you always have this existential crisis of who is this for and who am I reaching? And the fact of the matter is that I'm reaching some people, but not all of them. I can't reach them through the printed material because it's too expensive for me to print. So online is the cheapest, but even that cheapness comes at a very expensive price. And so there's a lot of things to, there's a lot of things to unpack, but I think that summarizes my understanding of Namibia at the moment currently as a desert, as a small part of the world. But then again, my small part of the world is no different from Nontsi's part of the world, because Richmond, Virginia, maybe she can't leave Richmond. And maybe her experience of the US is always, hey, I get to leave Richmond and go elsewhere in the States. When you get imprisoned in Richmond, what's the difference between Richmond and Windhoek? That kind of thing. I'm just asking a question. Yeah, so I think, Saki, my answer to you is that the whole world is a small space. And these activisms, these different types of activisms with hashtags, online movements, whatever, all of those things are there to really to show us that regardless of where you are struggling, there is someone else in the world somewhere struggling in the same way that you are, and also with you, and in some ways for you. And for me, I think that right now is important, because these lockdown structures that we have a big danger of alienating us from each other and making us think that we're alone, wherever it is that we are. And the truth of the matter is that we aren't.
Yes.
Can I jump in quick? I want to pick up the thread where you brought in Zimbabwean Lives Matter, and then piggyback off what Rémy is talking about in terms of the idea of borders or borderlessness, what is happening. If we think about a space like Zimbabwe, where, before I left to come to the US in 2009, and then, during my time in graduate school, there were laws that prevented citizens from taking photographs outside of their own sort of private spaces. So you had to get a permit, you had to be a journalist to be able to document the space. And as a visual artist, especially once I left, thinking about how I would narrate or synthesize what was going on at home, or kind of think more biographically, or, became very difficult even coming home on break to try to do research. I couldn't photograph, and it was a real quandary. So other registers would become the things that I would use to narrate, like the printed matter in the street and things like that. But when you think about that, when you tell people you can't photograph, so even now when we have these mobile phones that can document, you train a society out of documenting and pushing out and publishing what's happening. And then once we then have the coup, and we also, Zimbabwe has also had mini lockdowns, because the government will tell you stay at home, and things are shifting out in the street and you're all indoors. I've gotten text messages from home, several times over the past couple of years of these different lockdown situations. And then all of a sudden the coup has happened. There's a televised announcement, and then everyone must go onto the streets and say the same thing and push out the same message. It was quite interesting for me to think about what happened within the digital sphere to the image of Zimbabwe, where previously it was images from journalists that were documenting either what they were allowed to document by the government, or other agencies from abroad coming in and documenting maybe people that have been beaten or tortured and fuel queues and things like that. So a lot of the devastation, ruined porn, you go into Zimbabwe, there's someone with a patch on their eye in hospital and broken leg because they were a political activist. And then you have the Mugabe must go moment, and then everything is about people dancing in the street with the army, with the cops, the army officers are everyone's best friend. And that was quite stark for me. One day you are Googling your home country and these images, horrific images are showing up, and the next images is total jubilation. And that is also the power of these kind of moments, that there's also some kind of policing of who can do what. And then if we think about the conversations around net neutrality in the US, and then you think about a space like Zimbabwe, where you have to buy bundles, you have to buy data for each platform that you want to use. If you want to use Facebook, you have to buy data. If you want to use, so that also changes. So as Rémy mentions, like, you know, sometimes I say to my friends, you know, a lot of my community are not on Instagram. People, you know, people that I connect with back home, Instagram is like is not the pedestrian, it's not the pedestrian class. You know, it's not the everyday man on the street. There's a different kind of person. And even on Instagram, no one is documenting the outdoors. They're documenting the interior spaces because we've been trained to kind of look inwardly and to present and project. So then when people even go onto Twitter, how are Zimbabweans engaging with that space? It has become a space for people to feel liberated to say what they think. It's a space outside of, you know, print, which has failed us, the newspaper, which is really co-opted by forces, you know, in authority. So people are looking for a space to say something, but we've been talking in whispers for so long, and we've been having to point the camera to ourselves and only project it to loved ones. Then that totally changes what is, you know, if I look at the hashtag as something that's an aggregate in a space for kind of archiving and going back to look at a strand of conversation that's aggregated around one theme or a sentence or word, then there's gaps. And for me, that reality is where I start to make my work. That the idea of publishing through all kinds of mediums, it becomes a way to think about that gap as content, or a sense of urgency to think about what we can do to kind of surface the things that have been hidden, submerged, silenced.
Yes. Yes, Bukola, would you like to say something?
Yeah, actually, I want to respond to something Rémy said about how our experiences are not unique to us right now. For instance, when the whole social solidarity thing on CSA started, we had published a newsletter, and I remember that there was a quote that I cited that was, "Diseases and ideas expose the power and danger of bodies in contact, as well as the fragility and tenacity of social bonds." And right now, what we can see is that the pandemic, the brutality in the US that has become a global protest and a form of revolution in itself, has exposed the fragility of our current human society. And also through the playlist and some of the reflections that have come through, from Awa Konaté's reflection that we published to the reflections by Zora Opoku and Wambiu Kabiru, we have seen that the experiences that we have now, from Wambiu losing her husband, to Opoku surviving cancer, to also having to deal with experiences from her childhood as in East Germany, prompted by the globalized protests. As earlier said, we all need to come together. We all need to create a form of, we all need to create actions that brings us together to fight the things eating at the core of humanity right now, which is thinking that we are different, which is thinking that one region, like Rémy also said, that we are in a small space. If we start to think that the world is a small space, that the online space is just an extension of that space, we can come together, we can begin to come together to create bonds in the work that we do, in the work that Rémy does, in the work that I do, in the work that Nontsikelelo does, in the work that other platforms do, to begin to come together and push out materials that can show that the society is fragile and we need to unite. I don't know if you understand that. I'm just speaking to something that Rémy said.
Yes,
no, Bukola, I totally understand you, and I agree with you that idea of smallness is actually not a limiting factor, but it's for me, at least, I think it's very powerful because it allows us to link closer to each other. And I can reach you and you can reach me. Whereas this idea of like, I must first board a flight to wherever the heck you are in order to interact with your work That's not often possible for even someone like me, but if with this online type of thing, it's very, very possible. So I totally understand and I agree with you 100%. That idea of smallness is actually a connecting factor rather than a divisive factor.
And it's always been that way. You know, I think there's always been a way to network because borders, now I don't necessarily want to speak to borders, but because space is a reality, space is a reality, and we cannot defeat that. Even now we're at a time difference. Even now we're using this platform, and sometimes there's a glitch, sometimes there's an echo. So, you know, there's always ways that we try to defeat it, but at least we're reaching out and we use those different means. I wanted to speak to this idea of smallness through Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place, her novel. I read this in graduate school and it connected me so closely to my own narrative as a Zimbabwean. You know, the idea of the weightiness of British colonialism that still hangs around, that you will never shrug. The idea of expatriates coming into a nation and rising to the top and becoming the you know, sort of 1% and being able to own certain parts of industry and downtown and things like that. People coming in and seeing the space for tourism and kind of disregarding the people, but also wanting to be close to the people because of their friendliness. And then always this connection to this other power, this other land, you know, the colonial master's land, that there's always a back and forth between people in the formerly colonized space and people in the sort of colonial motherland, that there's always this motion. And that again, with the water is a mode of transport, is continuing to produce this flow. It allows us to continue to touch each other. That conversation becomes ongoing, even if we are on an island.
What are we actually publishing at this time? For instance, what narratives, because I believe this is what this conversation is about, what narratives are we publishing now that reflects our experience of today?
Yes.
I'd like Notsi, for instance, to share from our own platform what they are doing, so that I can key into that to also see how it ties to what we are doing at TSA, for example.
I'll share after someone else because I just spoke. And I've loved hearing everyone's contributions, but I will share for sure.
But
yeah,
sorry, Saki, I just want to build on what you were saying, Bukola. But like when we talk about this idea of what narratives are emerging and what narratives are we talking, it is equally also very important of asking, but for whom and to whom are these narratives being produced? Because many of them have in fact been existing for many years. You know, they have been thriving in certain spaces. They've just been confined to not being to wider society. And it's also very important to think about, well, what's the direction that the narrative then takes if more people start engaging with it? And this is something I think is quite important to reflect on amidst everything that's happening with, like, you know, Black Lives Matter and liberation movements around Africa, Europe, and the US, and so on and so forth. Who are these conversations and the ensuing dialogues actually for? And who gets to sustain these dialogues? I feel like going back to what you were saying, Nonsi, you know, what we're seeing now is, and what we're seeing now and have been seeing with Black Lives Matter back in 2015 and 16, is just merely a historical continuum that's just erupted. And instead, in some way, instead of hoping for us to then ask the same questions that we've been asking for many years, question is, how are we then navigating that differently?
I find that all your comments have created an idea of convergence for me around the multiplicity of strategies of resistance, that it occurs in very complex ways, where the online space is not a replacement or substitute, but a supplementary part of a tactical mechanism that is part of strategies of liberation. And speaking about the idea of the smallness of the globalized public sphere of the online space, it almost also speaks back to the historical continuum of Pan-Africanism and how that occurred in a period when there was no digital technology, but still there was some way of circulation and connectivity of information between people of African descent in different parts of the world. I also wonder about this idea of polarization in the way that we're speaking about narratives and who they serve and the class divisions within them, and how even within the Pan-Africanist movements of the past, there was still this tension between elitist groups and so-called working class groups, and tensions between ideologies around socialism, Marxism, and other forms, communism. And so these tensions, I think, constantly reproduce each other in relation to each other in multiple ways. And the online space encapsulate that, and perhaps a call for decolonization to occur in the structures of society, in the real physicality of the world. There's perhaps a parallel to that, a need for a call for a decolonization of the internet. And with the digital divide that you spoke about to be considered, particularly within African. And so I think we're running out of time, but there's so much we could continue to speak about. I also wanted to just mention that most of your programs and platforms, they also have programs like reading groups, film screenings, and other forms of printed material. TSA, for example, has a limited edition print run. So I just wanted to open up the panel to questions from our audience. Michael, I believe, is going to read out the questions for us. And if there are no questions, we can continue our conversation.
There are questions.
There are questions.
Hi, guys.
It's like 5 of them. Yeah, okay.
Hi there. So we have a question from Tammy Langtree. And it says, to any of the speakers who want to respond, how do you think about the online space as an archive for an Africa we can contribute to and define differently? And I see that Rémy.
I'll go. I want to go first because all the other answers are going to be incredibly smarter than mine. So I want to be forgotten as quickly as possible. The easiest answer I have to Tammy is that the online space really, for me as the editor-in-chief of Duk, is that it is the only way in which I could contribute to this idea of Namibia, of Namibian literature or writing that was accessible to some people within the country, and then also that was accessible continentally. I do not have a publishing house. I don't have print distribution. I can't access all of those other things. So online was the cheapest way for me, and it was also the easiest to reach some of my desired demographics. Is it a democratic and open system that everyone can contribute to? No, because it's also, again, couched and shielded in many layers of privilege that are not prevalent here. But it was the only way for me to achieve some of the goals that were realizable, which ties into the second thing that she asked about, how do you go about changing these monopolies? One step at a time, one person at a time, one struggle at a time, and actively being transformative within your head and deciding to do things differently. Like for me, it was very simple to, not very simple, it was very hard when I was confronting the idea of Namibian literature, because to be frank, all the stuff that we have from Namibia is like sunsets or bloody rhinos or like tourist photos of like Bushmen and whatnot, the sand, and I thought that was nonsense. I think it's garbage. I really think we needed to move beyond German-based volunteers coming here to write about Namibia, or British tourists writing about friendly natives and stuff like that. So even in Namibian literature, contemporary Namibian literature, we still had that colonial gaze that was here, and the only way to confront that was to start this thing in the cheapest way that I could, and that was online. How do you maintain its integrity and challenge this colonial gaze that Namibia has been suffering from under and is suffering under? By trying to open it up to as many people as possible to submit, and then actively, consciously removing and turning away all the people who are not in line with the message, i.e. activism, i.e. Black Lives Matter, i.e. I'm so sorry that you wrote about Swakopmund and the lovely sunsets and the sand dunes, but this is the shit that we've been suffering from years ago. We need to write about the poor people in your little German town. It's actively looking at like a piece of writing, a piece of text, a photograph, and asking yourself, is this what we want to be putting out there in the world? Is this going to spark our Black imagination? Is this going to help us in our struggle for economic freedom, for equality, for justice? If it isn't, you actively turn that away. Not this nonsensical things of like all lives matter or all writing matters. Let's face it, all writing does not matter. And so if you're writing like some nonsensical piece about, I don't know, man, like a safari to like the most expensive lodge in Namibia, we're gonna turn that away because this little space that we could afford by ourselves is not the platform for that. And I think that answers in some way how we go about challenging these monopolized spaces. With our platforms, we can't afford to be drowned by the notion that we are at the same level as other publishing houses or other media platforms, because we're not. And so I'm sorry if you're, one of these, what we call, in Namibia, we call them conservation whites, the ones who give money to like everything that is Black except Black people. That means Black rhinos. Jesus Christ, if you are, I wish I was a rhino because I would get funding so quickly. But this is something very passionate for us because we're like, on our small platform that very few people know about or very few people read, and therefore very few people can access, and we're Black and we're trying to do all of this Black Lives Matter thing, trying to bring Namibian literary consciousness to ourselves and to the world. We have to be actively transformative and turn away things that do not meet our agenda. This idea of radical solidarity, of radical Namibian solidarity. So how do we challenge that monopoly, that everything else? By actively rallying to our own causes and our own calls, and being brave enough to say, I'm sorry, we're not writing about Black rhinos today, we're writing about dead Black people, because these people are dying as well. And to be frank, as a Namibian, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I hope all the rhinos die so that we can finally deal with our problems. The rhinos have done nothing to me. They really, I've seen rhinos, they're lovely creatures, but at the moment, as a Namibian literary magazine and having taken a stance in what we publish and who we're about, I feel like I have to say one of us, at least on this radical solidarity platform, has to make the statement. Once we get rid of all these rhinos, can we then now just have a conversation about us, about Black, white, about Namibia German, about Namibia South African, about Herero, Nama, or Shuambo, whatever? Can we start talking about ourselves? And most importantly, what I think I said at the beginning, about this small space that we must all live in together somehow, some way, because we have got nowhere to go. We can't migrate because the world is locked up. And I can't go to the moon because it is uninhabitable. So we need to talk about a small space as Windhoek, as Namibia, as Africa, as Earth, because no one's coming to get us. We've only got each other.
Sorry, I was just going to answer brief on Tammy's question and say, but Tammy, there are a wealth of people who are already using the online space as an archive for in Africa. But I also think sometimes like the language of how we talk about it we should be more mindful of that. Because when you say contribute to and define differently, the question is who are we contributing this to and who are we defining this differently for and who? That's really important to have in mind, because there is in fact, CAS, my platform, is just one of a fraction out of thousands and many. They're both online and offline, and they are working really intensely and working quite ardently, engaging with the archive and trying to really map an entrail of memory and trying to look at what memory has dissipated and what memory has been ruptured, and how do we try to reinstate this continuum in our shared structures and our shared histories. So that's already been done. And then to answer the second question that you're now saying, what's the best way to approach open source with the realities of the monopoly on knowledge and information? Share it. That's the best way of doing it. Share it with people around you and be really, really mindful of how you're able to engage with it that someone else isn't, and hold space for someone else around you and try to make that possible for them.
Yeah. I mean, I really want to second what Awa and Rémy have said. I think the idea of the small space, maybe translating that also to the small audience, or thinking about how I started reading Zimbabwe with Tinashe Mushakawanu. That project is a selfish project. It was a project for me and my small crew of Zimbabwean friends living in New York at that time, where we had questions about the literary canon of Zimbabwe. We had read so few books by Zimbabwean authors because of our education, because of access to those kind of publications in Zim when we were growing up. What is still in print? Who is even talked about? You know, who is seen as notable? And so we started just with a simple Word document listing books. Tinashe is a literary scholar, so we listed books. You know, we had 10 pages of books. The author bio, synopsis of the book, and I was like, oh, let's just share this with our small crew as a Google Doc. And then the next day I was like, no, this is a website, and brought in a junior, brought in a programmer to help us make this thing happen. And that publication, I mean, that online space, that archive has grown to over 2,000 entries. And hopefully we'll be able to open it up so other people can add entries to it, you know, on their own. But this has been so wonderful, like something that started as just my own needing to kind of fill my own kind of knowledge base, has been a gift to my family, has been a gift to my community of Zimbabweans that live abroad, has been a gift to Zimbabweans back home. We don't purport to have all the content. The gaps are reality because of the power structures in literature, because of where we are, but we have access to certain things, and we use that access. We go into archives in the US, we document books that you can't find back home, especially ones in vernacular languages. And people are tweeting, you know, entries from Reading Zimbabwe. We've got an Instagram, we post and things like that. So, you know, really kind of pushing that and making it accessible at many different levels. Sometimes there is this thing of like, you know, looking at the archive and thinking the archive must have everything, and looking at particular sources as the authoritative source, the Smithsonian archives and places like that, certain libraries as the ones that are the authoritative source. But what Reading Zimbabwe has taught me, what producing other projects like Home Means Nothing to Me, about Dambudzo Mayochera, mapping his life in the Harare City Center, Some Writers Can Give to Heartbeats, where we aggregate quotes by different Zimbabwean authors under themes and then add in images from our own personal family photo albums in place of images of people to tell stories that we don't have access to, like that documentation, but realizing that our own personal narrative is authoritative documentation, it is archive. I think shifting the lens, not allowing yourself to be made a subject in that, you know, kind of colonial anthropological gaze, but allowing yourself to be an authoritative voice and acknowledging all the resonance with history, with the contemporary, with the future. Those three projects that I mentioned have taught me a lot, and it was just starting with a sense of my own questioning, my own loss, acknowledging erasure, and trying to do something about it. And then for us, it is building a sort of a rubric and telling people, this is an excuse for you to do your own thing, demystifying it. Like, you know, we're just two people with a student who made this website, and then we just plod at it every single day. So you can do it too. There could be a reading Thailand, there could be a reading all kinds of communities whose literatures are being sort of stifled, flattened, where you can't see the voices of your nation chronicling and documenting and narrating their own situation, where there's always some other, you know, some other authority or kind of expert coming in, flying in for 2 months, asking you all the questions and then going back writing about you, and then they're the expert on your life. So for me, that's the answer: taking up agency into your own hands, starting from where you are, and acknowledging that every kind of intentional aggregation of content becomes an archive that has some sense of authority.
And thinking differently about what archives actually are, because people are also archived. We have community members that are archived and they carry such vital and significant histories. And just going back to what you were saying, Nontsikelelo, the problem with the idea of archive, especially for those of us that engage with material heritages from libraries and from institutions, sometimes the archive material that we come across, and as the archive is very, very implicated in the statehood, and is very, very implicated within a form of disciplinary sovereignty. And that's really important to remember. So if you are engaging with archive, the question that you have to ask yourself is also, am I reproducing perhaps a sense of violence as this may already exist within? Or am I actually in some way trying to not subvert, but trying to enforce a care of practice in how I engage with archive and what kind of narratives I'm trying to draw out from them? So that's really important. Going back to Tammy's question about, how can we contribute to and define differently? The question is, what's your intention with engaging with the archive? And what are you hoping to avoid having to sort of reproduce from it again? That's really important.
Yeah.
Saki?
Oh,
yes.
Okay,
Don't mind, I will make a contribution. For me, it's about agency. When you go online, what are you looking for? When you say, how do you think about the online space as an archive for an Africa we can contribute to and define differently? It's about what do you want to do? What interests you? What story do you want to change? What narrative do you want to put out there? What do you want people to find 50 years from now that is representative of Africa? For instance, 2 years ago, I was looking online for posters of art exhibitions from 1920s to 1950s. And it was surprising that only Smithsonian and the London Contemporary Art Institute or something like that had materials that I could use for what I was researching for. And if you look at now, this is not something that you will find difficult to access. And the digital space has made that possible. At least, well, you can find this from the couch of your house. You can go online and look for posters of exhibition now. So 50 years from now, people in the world at that time will not have the difficulty to look for such materials online. I think the internet, the digital space, creates that kind of accessibility. And also, I saw in the comment section or in the chat group, someone asking if printed matters still matter. I would say yes, although there's a tension between the digital space and the printed matter space or publishing space, print publishing space. But still, they are both very valid and valuable places of knowledge sharing, knowledge production, and knowledge sharing. And so both sides are very important. They are very valuable and they are valid. And that's how I would answer to what Tammy is seeking for.
Saki.
I think we have limited time.
Yeah. Saki, there's the last thing that you said. You said something else earlier, and I think Bukola touched on it, and Awa touched on it, and Nontsikelelo touched on it, is when you were saying something about Pan-Africanism, and the topic, the title of this week's sessions is Radical Solidarity. I think it's important to never forget that Pan-Africanism itself was an act of radical solidarity between Black peoples against oppressive, marginalizing whiteness. And so it wasn't a kumbaya type of thing. It was an idea that me and Bukola and Awa and Nontsikelelo, wherever we might find ourselves, our struggle is together because we're being oppressed together. And so that was radical solidarity. All of them realized in their respective small spaces, they were suffering against the same thing. And so I thought it was just a nice romantic ideal that you mentioned it. And, you know, it has this greater significance. But at the same time, it is important to never forget that Pan-Africanism was a self-defense mechanism against whiteness. And so engaging in any Pan-African struggle is not an embrace of whiteness. It is an active repudiation of it. And rather than embracing our common blackness, our similarity of struggle and oppression and, you know, marginalization. So I hope that, you know, that at least that sentiment is felt, because all of these other panelists have touched on it in way more eloquent words than I could. But I thought that was just like when it's called radical solidarity, and I thought it was just nice that you mentioned Pan-Africanism. And I thought Pan-Africanism is radical solidarity, but against a specific thing, not just everything. It's against whiteness.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up our conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I can see the engagement in the chat. Many people had questions that we couldn't answer, but I hope that still we're able to cover as much as possible. And I just wanted to wrap up with, you know, a connection I found in the conversations that we started yesterday was also around how as much as the body is at risk and a threat of a pandemic, so is the culture, mind, and spirit. The idea of a reclamation of the archives should not be perceived as a luxury, and that it is need. How we can find these sites of cultural power outside formal institutionalism. And we could even go on to speak more about, you know, what does Black aesthetics within digital arts mean? There were also questions around how reality becomes skewed by algorithmic practices. Thank you so much to our panelists for participating in the conversation. As Achille Mbembe mentioned, to reassemble fragments to read the agency. So a fragment becomes a vital component to that reconstruction of. So we have a program. It's a film screening by Zaheer, Rahmani, and can everyone hear me? Is there an echo? Please, may I ask you to mute your microphone? Is that better? Okay. So our next program is a film screening titled Seismography of Struggle Towards a Global Context of Critical and Cultural Journals by Zaheer, Rahmani. I'd just like to introduce Zaheer. She's an Algerian-born academic and author, and one of France's leading art historians and writer of fiction, memoirs, and cultural criticism. She is an art historian that is the director of the research program on art and globalization at the French National Institute of the History of Art, an interdisciplinary program that focuses on contemporary art practices in a globalized world, and it links many networks between France and abroad. She has curated Made in Algeria, Genealogy of a Territory, a large exhibition of colonial cartography, high and popular visual culture, and contemporary art at the Museum of European and Mediterranean Civilizations. She has also previously exhibited at the Dakar Art Summit this year and has multiple projects. So the film we're going to watch shortly on our YouTube live page is the outcome of a lengthy research process undertaken at the French National Institute of Art History and supported by Raw Material Company. It demonstrates the relevance of a global history of art and allows us to reassess and above all, to demonstrate the intellectual, artistic and political dynamics that were exercised at the heart of colonial empires. Seismography of Struggle is an inventory of non-European critical and cultural journals, including those from the African, Indian, Caribbean, Asian, and South American diaspora, produced in the wake of the revolutionary movements at the end of the 18th century until the year 1989, often born out of urgency and necessity. A critical and cultural journal is, through its hybridism, its mobility, and its precarious existence, a pure object of colonial experience. By its nature, it is a laboratory of modernity. The populations of the territories mentioned in the sound and visual work have experienced all types of colonialism, practices of slavery, apartheid, and genocides. Many figures appear, including intellectuals, militants, activists, writers, artists, and authors of literary, poetic, visual, and political texts. The montage of images and sounds covers texts and portraits of founders and languages and discourses, show a long continuum of graphical inventions included in over 800 documents. For over 2 centuries, print media has been a space that has accommodated varied experiences, and they have appeared with regularity in struggles. Okay, thank you everyone. Please make your way to the YouTube live. You'll find the link in the chat feature. Thank you, Nonsi, Bukola, Awa, and Rémy. Again, I truly enjoyed our conversation. And I hope you can also attend the rest of the events of the program.